So for discussion board 3, I'm going to be talking about William Jennings Bryan um, and the Fundamentalist Modernist Controversy of the 1920s with Bryan, in fact. So the Fundamentalist Modernist Controversy of the 1920s caused a social and religious upheaval of major proportions. It produced disruption in almost all large Protestant churches, especially among the Baptists and Presbyterians in all sections of the country. One of the most important men to be connected to the controversy was William Jennings Bryan. In fact, until his death, there were few scholars who would argue that he was among the leaders of the fundamentalist position. In fact, most of the articles that I read agreed, with the exception of one article. I did find one article written by a Ferenc Sazi, which was entitled William Jennings Bryan, Evolution and Fundamentalist Modernist Controversy. So in this video, I'm going to talk about Bryan's involvement in the controversy and why, out of all the scholarship that exists, Saziz believes that Bryan was not a fundamentalist. So I'm going to start by talking about the Bryan as the fundamentalist. So in one article I read, it was by Christy Maddox, called Fundamentalist Fool or Populist Paragon, William Jennings Bryan and the Campaign Against Evolutionary Theory. Maddox said that Bryan's religious views were considered by many scholars to be fundamentalist. In fact, an author, Myron G. Phillips, claimed that Bryan's religious feelings were augmented by a thorough grounding in fundamentalism. Another author, Jack Mills, saw Bryan's speeches as colored by his deep religious conviction, in which a firm adherence to fundamentalism was dominant. Now, Maddox states that Bryan only became a fundamentalist in 1920, which is an accepted idea. He was seen as the accepted leader of the fundamentalists, not only within the Presbyterian Church, but throughout other Orthodox evangelicals within the country by 1925. Mattis takes the stance that Bryan, a populist, made moral value claims about what was good and moral and just, and often promoted policies throughout his life as a statesman in politics that would promote and protect the interests of the common people against the exploited practice and interests of the elite. But Maddox said that when it came to fundamentalism, he only incorporated it in limited ways, which arose out of scientific ways of thinking and tended to make fact-based claims about what was true and verifiable. This came about particularly, you can see, when he takes the witness stand in the Scopes trial. He says he took the witness stand promising to, quote, protect the Word of God against the greatest atheistic or agnostic in the United States. Okay? Now, in another article by C. Allen Russell titled William Jennings Bryan, Statesman and Fundamentalist, Russell states right away, though, that Bryan was fundamentalism's best-known spokesman, and that Bryan brought fundamentalism to the attention of the masses through his opposition to the theory of Darwinian evolution. But in contrast to Maddox, who states that Bryan came to fundamentalism in his later years, Russell states that fundamentalism had been carried with Bryan from a very young age. He believes that one of the reasons that people tend to equate Bryan with coming to fundamentalism late in life has to do with him putting increased efforts into speaking, preaching, and teaching about his religious interest after his retirements from being a statesman. Um, Now, the last article by Ferenc Saziz, William Jennings Bryan, Evolution and the Fundamentalist Modernist Controversy, is interesting because Saziz argues that William Jennings Bryan had little to do with the origins of fundamentalism and that he differed from the leaders in theology, tactics, and his view of the nature of American society. He further argues that evolution was a peripheral issue among fundamentalists until Bryan himself made it an issue in the 1920s. He takes the position that Bryan was by no means the main leader of the fundamentalist movement and was not a fundamentalist himself. His reasoning comes from the belief that Bryan differed from other fundamentalist figures in theology, tactics, and the nature of American society, and wasn't even involved in the controversy in the early 20th century and the formation of the controversy, and that his involvement didn't come until the late 1920s, or until the 1920s. He states that when Bryan does become involved, that he changes the whole controversy beyond recognition because he brings to the table the issue of anti-evolution. So I think that in the whole, William Jennings Bryan is a very interesting man when it comes to fundamentalism.